Well, good evening and welcome to our first event of the month here at the Muscarelle Museum. We're thrilled to have you. This, as you know, is a continuation of selected topics in architecture. We do this every spring. We're thrilled to have you with us tonight. My name is David Brashear. I'm director of the Muscarelle Museum and often the host of our programs on selected topics in architecture. I wanted to let you know that tonight we will be recording this event, and also that if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat or in the Q&A function of Zoom, and my assistant, Lauren Green, who is producing tonight's program, will get those to me at the end of the program. So without any further ado, let's get started. Great to have you with us. We're having just a little bit of production difficulty here. Great. As you know, our topic for this evening is the architecture of transportation in Washington, D.C., and we have a number of really interesting projects to work through. Well, train travel flourished across the United States in the late 19th century, and railroads built passenger terminals and stations in the cities they served. And eventually there was this movement to build unified or union stations in cities across the United States. Indianapolis was first, and the idea was to serve as a passenger rail hub and a base of operations for a multitude of railroads. In 1901, the major railroads serving Washington, D.C. announced their own plan to build a unified station, and with the support of Congress, embarked upon the project. And so Daniel Burnham, the Chicagoan noted for his Beaux-Arts style and his embrace of the City Beautiful movement, was selected as the architect. And when the new station designed by Burnham opened a few years later, it would be the first grand gesture of architecture serving transportation in the nation's capital. You can see here, it was grand on the outside, but also grand on the inside, and still is today. Well, our story tonight starts a half century later, when the Washington metropolitan area launched the first in a series of transportation projects that would all be grand gestures and in some ways make Washington unique among American cities, having true architectural landmarks serving as the backbones of the region's architectural infrastructure. We'll examine tonight three projects: Metro, Dulles Airport, and Reagan National Airport, through a variety of lenses, but most importantly, we're going to seek an understanding and an appreciation of why they are what they are from the perspectives of aesthetics and design. As we discuss Metro, we'll focus on the architect and main designer, Harry Weese. With Dulles Airport, we'll focus on Eero Saarinen. And at Reagan National, we will focus on César Pelli. What I think is incredibly interesting about this trio of projects is that they all have touch points to the famous architect, Eero Saarinen, to the school in Michigan, Cranbrook Academy, which he founded, and to his son, the short-lived Eero Saarinen. So more on this as we progress, but I wanted to raise your awareness regarding these connecting points early on. So please watch for them. Well, Washington was a city that for a long time struggled to gain traction. It wasn't a port. It didn't have proximity to important natural resources. And so industry was never really a driving force for growth. But Washington really came into its own as a city and even a budding region during and after World War II. The war required a massive federal effort, and the government expanded exponentially to meet that challenge. By the end of the war, almost 250,000 people in the Washington metro area worked for the federal government. And government contractors also set up shop so that by 1949, the metro area had the highest average household income of any major metro area in the United States. And not surprisingly, automobile ownership expanded greatly across the United States following World War II, and that drove a trend that accelerated as the years progressed of suburbanization in every major city. More cars on the road meant more traffic, especially in commutes to and from work. And this obviously is some of the traffic in Washington, D.C., close to the Capitol. And so what are the solutions for dealing with traffic congestion? There are two: more highways and mass transit. And in early 1955, President Eisenhower announced his support for highway expansion with substantial federal funding. We know all about that system that was created at that moment in time today. But Eisenhower did something else that was of great importance. He supported the creation by Congress of the Mass Transportation Survey. And from that effort, the National Capital Transportation Agency was eventually established. And a key charge of the NCTA was to generate a comprehensive plan for transit for the Washington metropolitan area. After years of study and a variety of rail transit proposals, the NCTA administrator in 1962 put the goal for the coming system in, I think, the simplest terms. He said the goal was to get most people to within a 5-minute walk to work once exiting this transit system that they were planning. The core challenge of the system was this: how to create a system that brought commuters in from the suburbs efficiently and then moved all riders quickly around the core of the city. This was a challenge. It would need to be, as a system, an urban subway combined with a regional rail system. But in this case, as one standardized system with one standardized technology across both objectives. Eventually, a core system was adopted in 1965. From that, a larger system would later emerge as the driving plan. And I'm showing you the rails here in blue and the connecting bus lines that were planned at this moment in red, largely to keep costs down. In February 1966, President Johnson sent a letter to Walter McCarter. He was the new administrator of the NCTA, challenging the agency to aim high aesthetically. And I wanted to just read you a couple of excerpts from this letter from Johnson. He wrote this: "While we seek to resolve problems of moving people and goods within the congested national capital area, our concerns must not be confined to the utilitarian requirements of transportation alone. We must take this opportunity to make our capital a more attractive and inspiring place in which to live and work. Congress has already enacted legislation to assure that beautification is a major consideration in the development of our highway system. The same concern must guide development plans for mass transit." And he urged them to think creatively and to do something amazing. One key decision that was made early on was to have all the stations designed by one architect. That way, building consistency and also minimizing complexity when it came down to construction. Now to find the architect. They wanted a broad search, and to do so, they advertised in the National Architectural Press, but they also sent letters directly to a number of firms. And when Harry Weese received his invitation, and when his firm responded, they highlighted the fact that they had experience in both city planning and architectural standardization, this idea that they could produce many stations that would be similar in design. His firm's response to the request to submit a proposal was so good, they were considered the top candidate, and they won the job after Wiese was interviewed. So who is this guy, Harry Wiese? He had a lifelong interest in art. He studied architecture at MIT. While there, he was enamored of Scandinavian design. And his time at MIT was followed by a fellowship to study city planning at the Cranbrook Academy, which we mentioned just a few minutes earlier, and that was in Michigan. Wiese's time at Cranbrook, though, involved little city planning, and surprisingly, because of all that was going on around him there, very little architecture, although he did occasionally help one of his friends, Ralph Rapson, who worked in Saarinen's practice, Eero Saarinen's practice there at Cranbrook, on drawings like this one attributed to Wiese and Rapson. But mostly at Cranbrook, Wiese was involved in learning crafts, very much in the European tradition, and in some ways similar to what he might have experienced had he been a student at the Bauhaus. Elio's son, Eero, worked with him at Cranbrook in the architectural practice, and Eero would become a lifelong friend of Wiese, even though both of them were seeking the affections of the same lady at one moment in time, who ultimately became Eero Saarinen's wife. Well, from Cranbrook, Wiese went to Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, the very important New York firm, and then opened his own practice in 1947. So let's take a look at Wiese and his resume that put him in that top position in the NCTA's beauty contest. By the time he was selected to be the architect in 1966, Wiese had been in private practice for almost 20 years, and he had an impressive resume by 1965. He was clearly a noted modernist. But he also believed that a building ought to be responsive to its environment. And so there's really no distinctive Harry Wiese style to speak of, but just a continued march through the application of modernist themes and restrained design with reflections and inflections of the history and physicality of place within his projects. And perhaps this was something that he took away from Cranbrook. So let's take a look at some of his projects up to the time he was selected for Metro. Here you see the US Embassy in Accra, Ghana. Another shot. Here is an apartment building in Chicago. A set of townhouses that he co-designed with I.M. Pei, also in Chicago. The Lillian Schmidt Elementary School in Columbus, Indiana. Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. So he was no stranger to Washington, nor the modernist movement that took place in Southwest D.C. In the wake of urban renewal. The Northside Junior High School in Columbus, Indiana. This was made to look very similar to some of the warehouses in a district nearby. The First Baptist Church of Columbus. And finally, the Time Life building in Chicago. And here we can clearly see a reflection of all of the great work that Mies van der Rohe had done in Chicago, a very Miesian style to this building. So here we have Wiese. He's attentive to place. The team Wiese assembled within his firm knew very little about rapid transit, and so they embarked on a world tour. They visited subway systems in many cities, and importantly, they were able to distill the essence of what they saw. They went for an approach ultimately that was respectful of the riders. They adopted as their guiding principles bits and pieces of what they had liked on their grand tour. They weren't going to build a utilitarian type of system in the flavor of Toronto. They were going to aim higher. They wanted passengers to be delivered directly from the street to the subway platform, as they had seen in Berlin, meaning no mezzanines. And like Milan, the entire system would have a unified graphic design. There would be no commercialization of the spaces. Newspaper vending machines would be standardized, and advertising would be minimized. There'd be climate control, and they expected to keep their palette of materials very small. They decided that underground stations would be vaulted, and you see that in Wiese's drawing from 1966 here. Vaulted much like the cast iron train sheds at most turn-of-the-century train stations, both in Europe and in the United States. And with that vault they would eliminate the use of columns. And so Weese presented this concept sketch to the NCTA in July of 1966, and they bought it. But in the weeks that followed the NCTA presentation, the engineers had suggestions. If you were going to do this system, which was called in Wiese's terms, cut and cover, dig a trench, build the station, and then cover the trench over, why not be efficient? Keep the space monumental, but simplify it and reduce costs by making the stations rectilinear. So Wiese's primary goal was to keep the underground stations open and grand. He didn't want to repeat what had been done so ineffectively in New York. And he was reluctantly convinced to maintain that space to go along with the engineers' box approach to the stations. And throughout 1967, Wiese and his team prepared alternatives that could be done in the absence of a vault. He had several meetings with the Commission of Fine Arts, which was an advisory body for the capital area throughout 1967. One was on April 18th, in which he introduced this concept that they had developed in 1966 of exposed rock in some stations that were in rocky terrain. On June 20th, he presented his box designs for the cut and cover stations, following the engineers' leads. And then one on September 19th. And this was another box design that Wiese presented, but this is where an indignant Gordon Bunshaft, who was the renowned Skidmore, Owings and Merrill architect, he grabbed a pen and delivered a sketch of what he thought the subway should be. So this follows a sequence of meetings. And the reality is it's no great leap forward. It was likely a drawing driven by his memory of the original sketch by Wiese that was shown to him a year earlier. But what it allowed with the tantrum that Bunshaft put up was it allowed Wiese and his team to return to their original plans and move on overall design of the system in that vaulted format. I just wanted to show you this. This is Wiese's drawing from 1966. This is Bunshaft in 1967. So what did they do? They decided that one of the key features of the vault down in the subway stations would be rectangular coffers. They'd be of poured concrete. You see it on the far right here, but it would deliver monumentality and at the same time link to other parts of the capital area. They'd use a limited palette of materials again and again. They'd have granite curbs, granite benches, and lighting posts. And they would also use an abundance of indirect lighting to really give a level of monumentality. Well, the adopted system was finalized in March of 1968. It totaled 97 miles. And after removing the core 12-mile system right at the center, each jurisdiction, Maryland, Virginia, and DC, got roughly the same number of miles. The first iteration, though, was going to be that core, and it was a system as authorized by Congress that focused on two main lines. One that ran from Silver Spring to Van Ness, and one from the stadium to the airport. The design of the cars was a project led by the NCTA. It didn't involve Wiese, but the idea was to merge, as I said earlier, a subway system with a regional rail system. And what you needed to do that was a car that would be comfortable over longer journeys. And so they showed a prototype of the car on the mall in 1968 near the Washington Monument. And then soon thereafter, they delivered that to the White House lawn so that President Johnson could have a closer evaluation of it. That design for that car was later incorporated in a small slice, full-size replica of a train station and how it would look in the underground. And so let's just take a look at this. This is the model being built. And this is the completed station. I think it was 18 feet long, and otherwise it was at full scale. But what they wanted to do is demonstrate all of the different design aspects that they had been working on as an architectural team. So you can see the car, you can see the indirect lighting, the tile on the floor, the granite curbs, the flashing lights, everything. Beginning in December of 1969, construction proceeded across a broad part of the central system. And I wanted to just show you a few construction photos. This is Gallery Place, Chinatown. This is the idea of cut and cover, right? It's not so far beneath the surface. Metro Center, that grand station under construction in 1974. Rails came in lengths of almost a quarter mile to a temporary storage site. And why that was important was they were so focused on giving a comfortable ride, not having short rail segments, but rather giving a smoother ride over longer rail segments that didn't have the connector points. DuPont Circle under construction in 75. The floor being installed at the Pentagon. And then to some of the design aspects. Well, Massimo Vignelli was a designer. He was on the team that Wiese put together. He actually was the one that came up with the name Metro, but he also was the one that formulated the M and the way the map would be configured. And you can see some of his early designs for the Metro user map circa 1973. And of course, this is the official Metro map from March of 1977, and showing the entirety of the planned system. Well, almost as a demonstration project, the first portion of the system opened on March 27th, 1976, with 4.6 miles available on the Red Line, with 5 stations from Rhode Island Avenue to Farragut North. And I have them outlined in black in the center. So just a short little demonstration project, really rather interesting. It included the Farragut North station. So you got a full dose of what the Metro was going to look like. And you also would have seen the crossed vaults at the Metro Center station, even though a second train wasn't yet running through that station. In several stations, you would have seen the long expanses of escalators. DuPont Circle was not yet open, but it's an excellent example of how escalators serve the Metro. And so here it was. The system started out small in 1976, but it did expand quickly with major additions in 1977. And 1978. And the entire system there basically almost fully built out, at least the core of it, by 1983. And so this is the official Metro map from 1979, and I think it's so instructive. It's beautiful how they put it together. Vignelli's design was amazing, and what I think is especially effective is it pronounces the end game, even though the end game isn't there yet. And so you see those stations to come on the dashed lines of the line, some of which haven't even been started in any way as of 1979. And then today, there are many more forms as the Metro system has expanded through the years, all paying homage to Wiese's original designs. And the planned Silver Line station, which will be opening next year at Dulles Airport. This is the extent of the system as operating today. It will be a little bit longer as the Silver Line there on the left of your screen begins to move out all the way to Dulles Airport and just beyond. And this is the map of the system that's operating today. And you can see the dashed lines going out the Silver Line. for the future. I think most of those stations are activated next year. So that's the metro. Well, next we'll move to Dulles, and the architect that was selected to run that program, Eero Saarinen. He was born in Finland in 1910. He's the second child of Eero and his wife, Loha, who was an artist. And Saarinen and his sister grew up in an environment that encouraged the development of artistic talent. And he became an excellent artist and an excellent sculptor. When he was 19, he left the United States to study sculpture in France. And when he returned, he enrolled in Yale's School of Architecture. Following his graduation, he did an extended journey to Europe and around the world, and he visited important architecture. And then once he returned, he began an artistic partnership with his father. And father and son worked on many projects together throughout the 1930s and 1940s. And the office was very quickly highly regarded and broadly known throughout the United States. Well, in 1947, the federal government held a design competition for a proposed memorial to Thomas Jefferson and our nation's early westward expansion. And both Eero and Eero entered with separate entries into that competition. And kind of surprisingly, Eero actually won the competition above all the other entrants, including his father. And this was the marking of a coming of age for a man who had generally been the apprentice to his father, but was now 37 years old. So they worked on many projects together, including one of the largest architectural developments in the history of the United States, the GM Technical Center. And that work proceeded for a number of years, but was not fully completed by the team of them because Eero Saarinen passed away in the early 1950s. And so after the death of his father, Eero consolidated the practice and began the journey that involved many new clients and important architectural breakthroughs. So here at MIT, the auditorium and chapel, the War Memorial in Milwaukee, just to give you a flavor of some of the projects. And ultimately ending up at the TWA Flight Center in New York. Both the exterior and the interior, true masterpieces and widely acclaimed. Well, it was really with this resume that Saarinen is approached to help in Washington, D.C. Not only had auto traffic expanded dramatically in Washington, but air traffic had expanded there as well as it had in many cities following World War II. And in an effort to sort of work on that burgeoning air traffic situation and problem, Congress passed the Washington Airport Act of 1950, making construction of a second Washington airport a federal priority. And this new airport was intended to focus on overseas and long-haul domestic flights and to handle jet traffic. As you can see here at National Airport, air travel was largely accomplished at that moment in time through propeller planes, but jets were just making an emergence. And so this new airport was going to focus on the needs of jet aircraft. Well, there was a long search for space, several options considered, and finally then, President Eisenhower selected a 10,000-acre site located 26 miles west of the city of Washington. And with the site secured, the federal government searched for that talented team to take on the massive project. And there they came upon Saarinen, who was riding high from his work on the TWA terminal, and that was who they wanted. And as the interviews commenced, Saarinen didn't disappoint. One of the CAA, Civil Aeronautics Administration agents, said this: he told us we should build a great entrance to the United States, not just another airport, and that is truly what we wanted to hear. And so they were off. The site was enormous. You can see it on the left-hand side of your screen here. It was far from Washington, but it nearly rivaled the city in size. Saarinen had always been an optimist, always had an eye trained on the future, and for him, this was an ideal project, and he was really energized by the scope of the opportunity. And he said this later, he said, "No one asked us to grapple with the problem of jet-age terminals beyond the question of pure architecture, but I believe the architect has to assume that kind of responsibility. Therefore, together with a team of engineers and consultants, we decided to make a fundamental analysis of the whole problem of a large terminal for jet airplanes." And so they went out and did an amazing amount of primary research. They did an in-depth review of the functioning of an airport. They sent out teams with counters and stopwatches to see what people really did at airports, how far they walked, their interchange problems. They analyzed the special problems of jets. They examined schedules, peak loads, the effect of weather, baggage handling, everything in the operational framework. And they consolidated that research and data into a series of airport-specific reports and a set of charts, and they then set out to make sense of the data they had collected and looked for insights. And they really identified three main issues. The first, which they had already seen at TWA, was the problem of getting passengers to and from the planes, which had become a growing issue as airports extended longer and longer fingers from their main buildings in an effort to open up more gates along concourses. Second issue they identified was the high cost of moving jets around on the ground. And the third was a need for greater flexibility in the operations of the airport and the servicing of aircraft. And what Saarinen and his team decided was the way you solve those problems was to break the link between the terminal and the plane. And they came up with this idea of a mobile lounge that could dock with both the main terminal building and also individual aircraft, and it would serve as the passenger bridge. He was able to convince the FAA and the airlines to agree to this proposal, and so they began to work towards implementation of a system built around these mobile lounges. Well, with the overall approval of the mobile lounge concept, he worked towards finalizing the plan and arrangement of the airport. And so you can see they're examining all different ways to situate the approach road, which would be a dedicated road out to Dulles Airport, and also how one would view the architecture once you arrived on the airport property. He believed that the airport's architecture should be a logical extension of the federal buildings in the Capitol. He planned for the airport to have a degree of monumentality, not unlike the buildings in downtown Washington. With that goal in mind, and this was really the practice of Saarinen's firm, three-dimensional models were used to refine both the design of the main buildings and also the layout of the airport. And ultimately, what the team came up with was a design that featured a large rectangular terminal with a monumental control tower rising over it from behind. And as always with Saarinen, using the plasticity of concrete to deliver the necessary visual impact. He recognized the terminal would be greeting travelers arriving by both land and air. And so he incorporated a colonnade of tall concrete pylons on both the front and the rear facades of the building, with each row leaning away from the central core. So let's just investigate a number of the models that they developed as they refined this concept. And I think these are just fascinating. Give you a sense of scale of this model. This is a large model. I think the photography is amazing. What they would try to do is capture the building in a number of different atmospheric conditions and then use those photographs to discuss the project with their clients in the federal government. You can see the control tower coming out the back. And I think this is just an amazing photograph. This is the model illuminated at night and looking not very different from, quite frankly, a photograph I've taken at Dulles Airport from atop a parking garage at night. The inside hall that featured a cable roof hung between the row of taller front pylons and the row of shorter pylons across the back of the building. This giant hall for passenger services, 600 feet long, 150 feet wide, floor to ceiling windows on all four sides. Just an amazing amount of open space. And so the construction began, the pylons being formed and then poured, the roof being extended across the cables, panels being sent and set in those channels created by the cables. You can see the roof taking shape and that big central room also beginning to take shape. The control tower beginning to rise up. I'm a big fan of construction photos of major architectural projects. And there it is, sitting in that open farm field, far from downtown Washington. An aerial view from 1962, I think this is, not long after the basics were completed. And you can see the runways to the left and to the right of the main terminal in the center. And then seeming to hover over the plane as you looked at it from afar. The entire building sat beside a sunken parking lot on top of a multi-level base that facilitated the flow of passengers into and out of the building. And I want to show you in a minute just how this multi-level system worked, because this is new. So here are departures, the highest level. This is where you come to the airport, get dropped off, and take your flight. This is the second level highlighted in the middle. This is arrivals. Once you've arrived at the airport, this is where you would be picked up, the lower level. And then, of course, if you were actually parking at the airport, you would proceed down one level lower and off to the right here, be out into the parking lot. And here it is at the parking level, 2 levels down. The rear of the building, you can see the mobile lounges docked to the rear of the building. These would take passengers from the terminal to the planes and back again. And here they are. The main hall had no columns or supports for the roof. All the passenger services were arranged in a series of low kiosks and enclosures, and everything in the hall was executed in a palette of whites and grays. Saarinen believed that the interior should be thoughtfully organized. He believed it should be dignified and, as he said, intentionally different from what he termed the honky-tonk, Klondike-like chaos of commercial space in most airports. And that's not what you got at Dulles. The signage throughout the terminal was uniform in color and font, and the entirety of the composition evoked a level of serenity that was similar to the effect that he had delivered at the TWA terminal, but in an altogether different form. And so you can just see this space. And of course, with a far distant airport at the beginning of the jet age, it actually looks like it might be a pleasant place to visit, doesn't it? The reality of Dulles Airport is that it was a total work of art. It was something that Saarinen paid attention to from top to bottom. A reflecting pool as you head away from the central terminal and out towards the control tower. And then, of course, these ramps up and down that take you to the arrivals level or the parking level. His terminal at Dulles was widely applauded. Critics paid close attention to the achievement. And in a piece for the New York Times, Ada Louise Huxtable, that venerable critic, called it a superb monument to our time. And she recognized the theater that Saarinen had intended. She said this. She said, the visitor approaching the airport across the rolling hills of the Virginia countryside receives a double impact. The realization that he is viewing a kind of architecture of a force and importance unparalleled since the Renaissance, and that he is faced with a structure of singular beauty. And Saarinen himself recognized the magnitude of what he had accomplished at Dulles even before it was completed. On his last visit to the construction site in June of 1961, he died shortly thereafter of a brain tumor that he didn't know he had. He said this, he said, I think this airport is the best thing I have done. I think it's going to be really good. Maybe it will even explain what I believe about architecture. I think one of the most compelling testaments to Saarinen's foresight and the power of this design were the extensions made in the late 1990s by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill to each end of Saarinen's terminal, exactly as he had planned many years earlier. So remember this model? What was originally built was what I've outlined here in red. He planned for these extensions later on, and 8 pylons and 300 linear feet were added to each end of the terminal by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, essentially doubling the space of the terminal. This was done in the 1990s. You can see them building that extension here. Looks very similar to what was happening back in 1960. Again, just replicating all of the design. You can see that vast expanse of space opening up at one end of the extension. And then, of course, what we have today. Larger and perhaps a grander monument than its smaller predecessor. Well, our final project for consideration tonight is the monumental remaking of Washington's National Airport in the 1990s. Throughout the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, passenger traffic at National continued to grow as the region's expansion rolled on. And unfortunately, the way the growth that was handled was through the incremental addition of gates and terminals to serve the airlines based there. And in the end, the airport was not efficient and it wasn't a pleasant experience. It was time for an upgrade, time for a major transformation. And the task is laid out by the Washington Metropolitan Airports Authority, who had assumed control by then of both National Airport and Dulles Airport, was to recreate the northern terminals and connect them back to the original building and the region's historical roots. The goal was to usher in a new era for the terminal and the airport, while again connecting the new B and C terminals back to the region's historical roots, that original terminal. The architect selected for this project was César Pelli. And to me, once again, it's incredibly interesting that Pelli and with him were once again in the circle of Saarinen, that powerhouse designer. How? Well, Pelli worked for Saarinen. Pelli was born in 1926 in Argentina. He studied architecture at the University of Tucumán. He graduated in 1949. And interestingly, in 1952, he enrolled in the University of Illinois School of Architecture and received his master's degree in architecture from that institution 2 years later. Well, following graduation, Pelli went to work in Eero Saarinen's growing firm. And remember, Saarinen's father had just passed away, and he had consolidated the practice and was beginning to grow. He was there, Pelli was, as Saarinen's practice blossomed, and he was able to work on many of those landmark projects that passed through the office in the 1950s. He worked with a team on icons like the John Deere headquarters shown here in Moline, Illinois, on the Bell Labs facility in New Jersey, and on the TWA terminal, and also the Dulles Airport project. During his time with Saarinen, which was essentially a 7-year-long apprenticeship alongside other amazing talents like Kevin Roach, Pelli was instilled with an approach that demanded that each work respond to the place, the program, the client, and scores of other situational and environmental factors. So he has this in his background. He's working with Saarinen and Kevin Roach. And at the Saarinen firm, Pelli was exposed to thin frame construction sheathed in glass, which really became a hallmark of his work as he came into his own as a designer. The Saarinen firm had a penchant for glass designs that took the high modernist curtain wall in new directions. And what's really important is what happened here at Saarinen's Bell Labs project in Holmdel, New Jersey, because it was for this project that reflecting glass was first designed, the innovation that makes a glass skin possible in a practical sense because it keeps some of the sunlight out. So what Pelli would go on to do is experiment with glass so extensively that he became a master of sheathing buildings with glass, and often only glass skins. His interest in how architecture should express contemporary construction techniques was a product of his education as a modernist, but he also understood that a building should be shaped by the local flavor, the local culture, and the local history of its place and its urban condition. And so that's what's going to inform him as he comes to National Airport. His creations were as different as the places he designed for. After Saarinen passed away, he stayed at the firm for a few years as it consolidated its work and then wound its work down. And then he moved on to Los Angeles and worked at a series of firms there. In many ways, he takes what he learned at Saarinen's practice and molds it into his own objectives. He's pragmatic. He wants to create architecture that's productive, that's efficient, and foremost is cost effective. And so he evolves. He effectively melds the plasticity of some of Saarinen's work with concrete, cost-effective frames covered in inexpensive glass panels. The result being, many times, interesting sculptural form. So here's one of the first projects that we'll take a look at to get a sense of the materiality of his work. And, I think it's important to note, and I want to do more research on this, but he often worked at Gruen, the company where he designed this San Bernardino City Hall, in conjunction with a talented African-American architect, Norma Merrick Sklaric. So we worked with her on this project, on the Pacific Design Center, and on the Embassy Building in Tokyo. Well, in 1977, he has a huge coup. He is selected to be the Dean of the Yale School of Architecture. And shortly after arriving at Yale, he is hired, he wins the commission to design the expansion and renovation of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And this large and important project finally results in the establishment by Pelli of his own firm. He's now 50 years old, and it's called César Pelli and Associates. So quickly, let's take a look at a few of the projects he and his firm completed in the time leading up to National Airport. Of course, the MoMA Tower, the amazing World Financial Center at the bottom of Manhattan, the southern tip, adjacent to then the World Trade Center, 4 Leaf Towers in Houston, a residential complex, and then an office complex just nearby, 4 Oaks Place. And you begin to see Pelli experimenting with shape, but also using glass as a primary component on the externals of his buildings. The Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio. I just saw this building for the first time a couple of weeks back. The Norwest Center in Minneapolis. 777 Tower in Los Angeles. And then this comes after, but he's working on some of the preliminary designs, the Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur. Well, at National Airport, Pelli had very little land to work with, and he needed to connect to the historic main terminal, as we talked about, from the north. And so he and his firm worked on 4 different design options. And this is a view of their New Haven studio during schematic design. Well, ultimately, those 4 models were trucked in to DC for a presentation to the board in 2 U-Haul trucks. And essentially, the plan was this: be a connector. So César Pelli says this. He says a very large percentage of people, perhaps over half, will enter the airport through tubes. And you can see the arrows on the left-hand arm, sort of showing how people might be coming into the airport. Those connections might start from the garage or from Metro. You won't go from the exterior to the interior in many cases. You're going to go directly from, say, the Farragut North Metro station to the seat in your airplane without having gone from inside to outside. And this is the arrangement. This is the efficient arrangement that Pelli's firm comes up with to place on that very narrow strip of land at National Airport. So let's take a look at the architecture. As Pelli himself said this: the overall design is based on a 45-foot square, repetitive structural steel bay that establishes scale, flexibility, and architectural proportions. These spatial modular units are of a recognizable human scale at 45-foot square. Each bay is a dome with a central glass oculus. The dome is one of the most ancient symbols of shelter and also serves to establish a connection with the civic architecture of Washington, D.C. And so this is some of the work they did as they studied what the dome might look like at the firm of Pelli Clark Pelli. Well, what's also interesting about this thin sliver of a building running along the roadway and wedged between the road and the runways is that he compacted it by making it 3 levels. And he describes the way the terminal would be used. He says there are 3 levels in the building: ticket counters and the emplaning curb for departures are located on that highest level, the uppermost level. The main concourse is on the middle level, which you can see to the right in this model. And from the concourse, the passenger can exit the terminal building and proceed through an enclosed bridge to the Metro, or to 2 new parking garages, or to the South Terminal. And he said this design allows most passengers to move efficiently in and out of the building without the need of escalators or stairs. And he called the main concourse the main street of the building. It's airy, it's luminous, and it's a memorable place in Pelli's eyes. There was a little bit of cost engineering that needed to be done, but this is one of the final models at Pelli Clark Pelli's office in New Haven after eliminating a few of the domes. And then, of course, this is the final project. So many different, powerful, and serious aspects of this building, including this enormous window wall that faces onto not only airport operations, the gates and the planes, but also looks beyond the airport to Washington, D.C., looks upriver, and you can see some of the monuments. The entire program and project is elevated through what Pelli called the Architectural Enhancement Program, essentially the incorporation of works of art by many artists into the building fabric. And so the sites for the artwork include 10 floor medallions on the main concourse. They are each mosaics. 11 balustrades that overlook the concourse that are artistically decorated. 5 murals, 1 bridge sculpture, and a large sunscreen panel that runs the length of that window wall. Paul Goldberger, the noted architectural critic, wrote this in the monograph on National Airport. He said, Pelli's most significant achievement, or at least where he managed most effectively to break from the stifling conventions of airport design, is not in color or even in the making of space, but in the plan and the section he created for the terminal. Unlike virtually every other major airport in which the ticket counters fill the opposite wall from the main entrance and constitute the largest, not to say maybe the only, visual image the visitor sees upon arrival, Pelli turned it around. He placed the counters at National against the front wall of the terminal building so that they're behind the entering visitor, and the vista upon entering is not of counters and airline logos, but of light, of glass, and a view to the airfield, and with those great Washington sights beyond. And you can get a sense as you look at this photograph of the monumentality of that space. I'm sure many of you have been in it, of that main concourse in National Airport. And of course, finally, a view of the airport at night. And so there we have it, 3 amazing, amazing works of architecture, all serving in an interconnected way the transportation needs of a growing city, Washington, D.C. I love how Metro serves as a connecting thread. It was always there at National Airport from day one of Metro, and now Metro is reaching out to Dulles Airport as well. And so you're serving not only passengers through that system that live and breathe and work in Washington, but you're also connecting visitors with an ability to move among airports and in and out of the city. So that's all I have for you tonight. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Hi, David. Thank you for that talk. We do have one question in the chat from Janet, and she asked, was the DC Metro ahead or behind what was going on in other US cities?
Well, it's a great question because it was moving in some ways a bit parallel to what was going on in San Francisco, and also slightly ahead of what was going on in Atlanta. So those are the 3 modern systems of great significance, the 3 heavy rail systems that have been built following World War II in the United States. It's interesting because the Bart system in San Francisco was laid out in a different way. Each of the stations was designed by a different architect, and so there is that lack of uniformity as you move between the stations. As I mentioned earlier, the Washington Metro system is one that has a very unified design motif that moves from station to station, and even in the more recent stations, long beyond and past Harry Wiese's engagement and involvement, there are references made to that original fabric and infrastructure that he laid out initially.
Great, thank you. And we have another question from Lisa Bates. She asked if there are any plans to expand the Metro anymore.
It's such a great question. I recently spent time with a class, a William & Mary class in Washington, D.C. I taught 3 Friday afternoon 4-hour classes on each of these 3 topics. So I'm fairly well versed in them at the moment. First class was on Metro, second was on Dulles, and the third was on National Airport. And we had a guest from Metro on the day that we did that study. And there are a number of different things being considered. One of the key issues with Metro is as the system and its use has expanded, and as its reach has gone even further beyond the central core, you've created relatively long train rides. They never double tracked the system. And so there isn't an easy way for trains to sort of speed from far out locations and reach the downtown core. They have to make the stops at all the intervening stations. So they're thinking about some double tracking enhancements, and they're also considering rerouting the Blue Line, which now moves sort of through Roslyn and off down towards National Airport after it exits the city. They're considering a route in, the time frame has yet to be determined, but one that would take the Blue Line in through Roslyn, that section of Arlington, but through Georgetown. And Georgetown, as many of you know, lacks a metro station for a variety of reasons, probably the most important being that if you had a station in Georgetown that close to the river, the ability to get it underneath the river in the tunnel that was created was one that would have made that Georgetown station far, far below the surface. But anyway, they're thinking about potentially rerouting the Blue Line and kind of double tracking it potentially in a different direction. There are other sections that have been thought about and considered. Of course, Maryland is building what's called the Purple Line right now. That's going to be almost a beltway-like connector that brings several of the lines extending into Maryland into connection, but far out from the center of the core of the city, Washington, D.C. And I think there are other thoughts about whether or not you couldn't better serve Tyson's Corner, which is, I think, the 8th largest office market in the United States, bigger than downtown San Diego, but really, in terms of metro, is a bit of an afterthought. You could imagine justifying a whole additional sort of core of the system built around that massive office complex in Tyson's Corner, where so many people work from across the metro area. So they are thinking about it. I think one of the beauties of metro is that it has always been, very much unlike New York, a system that knew it had to expand. My wife and I just came off a nearly decade and a half of living in New York. And what always amazed me is that you could have declared the system complete in 1930 while the city continued to grow through the decades. So little has been added to the New York public transit system since shortly before World War II. But whereas with Metro, it's sort of an evolving entity with a great amount of care being paid to it by all of the important bodies in and around Washington, D.C. Anything else, Lauren?
No, that wraps up the question. So thank you for your time.
Great. Yes, thank you. I want to thank everybody for joining in tonight. And I also want to thank our good friends at the MCV Foundation and VCU Health. They sponsor so many of our programs here at the Muscarelle Museum and have been an important supporter of our selected topics in architecture program. So thank you for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you again at one of our next programs. Have a great evening.